Hey guys, today I'll show you a supernatural horror TV series named Archive 81 Season 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with a professional VHS tape restorer, Dan, who can easily repair even the most worn-out tapes. One day, someone sent him a box of VHS tapes. With just a few touches, Dan was able to successfully restore the tapes. However, the footage on them was terrifying. People circling around strange patterns, and a man brutally killing a woman in front of him. While Dan's colleague was quite frightened by the content, he calmly explained that the scenes were from a film that was never released due to its extreme horror. The male actor in the tape was the sender's father. 2 months earlier, the sender had found these tapes in her father's house and subsequently sent them to Dan. After that, Dan's boss assigned him a restoration task, but warned him not to copy the tape's content. Dan stayed up late to restore the tape, which turned out to be filmed by Melody, a sociology PhD student. She had wanted to write a paper on small communities, so she decided to stay in the mysterious Visser apartments in New York for a while and record everything she saw. The next day, his boss revealed that a wealthy businessman wanted Dan to restore the tape and was now eager to meet him. Following the address given, Dan found the LMG company where the boss, Virgil, was the one who had requested the tape restoration. Virgil mentioned he had a batch of severely damaged tapes and hoped Dan would attempt to restore them, offering $100,000 as a reward. However, the content of the tapes was absolutely confidential, and Dan would have to work on them in a remote mountain location. In the middle of the night, Dan replayed the tape that Virgil wanted restored and made a startling discovery. The dog in the video with Melody was the same dog from his childhood home. Further investigation revealed that there had been a fire at the Visser apartments which claimed 13 lives, but their bodies were never found. Moreover, there was almost no information to be found online about the LMG company. Determined to uncover the truth, Dan accepted the task. Afterward, Virgil led Dan to a house in a remote mountain forest where there was no internet and cell phone reception was unstable. Virgil gave Dan an emergency device, explaining that if he pressed the emergency button, medical personnel would arrive within 20 minutes. After Virgil left, Dan discovered hundreds of intact VHS tapes in another room, but he decided not to touch them for the time being. Soon, he successfully restored the first tape. He played it, and it showed that Melody decided to move into Visser apartments for her dissertation research. At the entrance of the apartment, she noticed many strange symbols. The building manager showed Melody to her room, handed her the keys, and warned her not to go to the 6th floor of the apartment. By night, Melody heard noises coming from inside the walls of her room. When she listened closely, she heard strange sounds. She was confused by the situation, but wasn't frightened. The next evening, she planned to knock on doors to visit each resident for her interviews. In the corridor, she met a little girl named Jess, who lived in the apartment and earned pocket money by running errands for neighbors. So Melody hired Jess to help contact the residents for interviews at a rate of $25 a week, and they quickly began collaborating. The first person Melody interviewed was a music composer. After listening to Purgatory created by the music composer, Melody realized it was the same sound she had heard through the wall. Later, Melody interviewed Jess, who shared her birth date and mentioned she was a 9th grade student. Melody wanted to delve deeper into the conversation, particularly curious about why people moved to this strange place. Jess's expression suddenly turned serious, and she nervously said that something had drawn them here. Then, Jess's face showed fear. She stood up rigidly and then fell to the ground, convulsing uncontrollably. Seeing the tape, Dan felt scared. He ran out of the house and called his friend Mark, urging him to quickly look into the LMG company and also to dig up information on Melody. Returning to the house, he continued watching the video. As it's shown, Jess recovered from her seizure and mentioned to Melody that her seizure happened occasionally and the doctors could not diagnose a cause. Suddenly, Melody exclaimed in front of the camera that Jess had been taken away. At that moment, the building manager reappeared, scolding Melody for going to the 6th floor and asking where Jess was. Then 2 more building staff appeared, intent on taking Melody away, who promptly began shouting for help in a chicken voice. At that point, a man approached, leaving Dan in shock because that man was his own father, who had died due to a fire incident. Dan repeatedly watched the footage of his father, trying to understand what was happening. All the while, unbeknownst to him, Virgil was monitoring every move he made. Later, Dan shared his discoveries with Mark over the phone. Unexpectedly, his psychologist father had been to Visser Apartments back in 1994. The video also confirmed that it was people from the local psychiatric hospital who had dragged Melody out of the apartment. Dan's father had been a psychologist at New York University, but Dan couldn't be sure what his father's relationship was with the psychiatric hospital. To Dan, there were too many coincidences, and it all seemed like a trap set up by Virgil. Back in the house, Dan continued to restore the next tape, learning more about the situation at that time. An old tenant from Visser Apartments was happy to be interviewed by Melody. However, in her view, the people living in the apartment were all very strange. The old lady enjoyed fortune-telling, and Melody drew 3 cards. The first card represented sorrow and pain, which resonated with Melody's troubled childhood. The second card suggested that Melody had come to the apartment for someone. Melody admitted that was true. She was looking for someone who had last been seen in this apartment before disappearing. The old lady advised Melody to seek out the woman in apartment 401 because she had been living there the longest and knew the most about the place, although few had ever seen her and her mailbox was rarely emptied. The old lady turned over the last card, which represented death, causing Melody to become immediately tense. At this time, Dan had confirmed that Melody was a patient of his father's. He phoned his friend Mark, instructing him to go to his house and find his father's patient records, hoping it might reveal Melody's identity. After hanging up, Dan noticed a figure in red watching him from a distance. He wanted to approach, but the figure quickly disappeared without a trace. Dan continued to watch the newly restored video. As it shows, Melody was later invited by a guy named Samuel from the apartment, planning to watch a performance at the theater. However, the show was bizarre, featuring a group of people in masks dancing strange dances. Samuel tried to ease her anxiety and, after comforting her, handed over the key to mailbox 401. But when Melody opened it, she found it completely empty. Jess came over and advised Melody not to focus on that room anymore because, in her view, it had always been unoccupied. As Dan was getting some food, he heard faint noises coming from behind the wall. He then broke through the wall with tools, uncovering a large basement. He ventured inside, where there were many rooms. In the back room, he found all the files labeled with a gene company. Moving further in, he came across a church with some letters carved into the chairs. Just then, Virgil suddenly appeared behind Dan. It turned out that Virgil had established the gene company. Virgil knew about the fire that had happened in Dan's childhood home, a fire that had claimed his father's life. Virgil mentioned that he had seen the fire department's report, which stated that Dan's father had been in a state of emotional collapse and thus had killed himself by setting the fire. Dan flatly refused to believe this, convinced that the fire was an accident. Virgil didn't argue, but he was certain that Dan's father had been suspended from his job at New York University, as he had found the suspension notice from that time. In the end, Virgil urged Dan to finish the restoration work and warned him not to return to the basement again. After that, Dan continued to repair the videotape, revealing more content. That evening, Melody heard strange noises again. Leaving her room, she went down to the apartment's common room where dozens of people were sitting silently, a statue placed before them. As time passed, their breathing quickened and then suddenly stopped. Once everyone had dispersed, Melody wanted to take a closer look at the statue, but hearing someone coming, she quickly hid her skinny figure. She then saw Samuel and the same music composer engaging in some smelly hormone yoga session. Dan was eager to see what would happen next and how long the hormone yoga would last, but just then, a loud, static noise came from the videotape. Melody found the apartment too eerie and confided the truth to her best friend staying with her. It's revealed that Melody had been abandoned in a church as a child and later received a letter from her biological mother, which was sent from Visser Apartments, leading her to come here for investigation. Afterward, Dan left his cabin without permission to find Mark and shared with him the bizarre incident, saying that the music played at the Visser Apartments residence gathering was the exact same tune his sister used to play as a child. After handing over the information he found to Mark, Mark broke startling news to him, saying that Melody had survived the big fire at Visser Apartments and was now living in Pittsburgh. If Dan had any questions, he could ask her directly. What happened at Visser Apartments years ago must be clear to Melody. Finally, the reason for Melody's arrival at the Visser Apartments was revealed. She had been abandoned by her mother and grew up in a church, baptized in doctrine from a young age. However, one day she inexplicably felt another world through random drawings, and she could feel something was there. Dan's psychologist father learned about her past through psychological counseling and referred to Melody's experiences as visions. Meanwhile, an anxious Melody hoped the psychologist could treat her. After her session, Dan's dog came over, and hearing the dog's noise snapped Dan back to the past. He then exchanged information with Mark, who suspected from his investigation of letters that Dan's father had been in trouble, possibly related to what he had published. Dan then inspected the fixtures in the bathroom but found no cameras. Virgil had claimed there was no network in the place, but a data port quickly revealed the existence of a surveillance system. Using equipment, Dan was able to watch the surveillance footage, and by reviewing it, he could find the blind spots in the monitoring to avoid Virgil's watchful eye. Meanwhile, Mark set out for Melody's residence with the belief that finding her would solve the puzzle. A review of the security footage showed that there were no cameras in the bathroom or the chapel. However, in a daze, Dan was placed in the activity room where Melody greeted him with warmth, which surprised him greatly. Judging by the dust in the air, this must have been an illusion for Dan. Sure enough, before much conversation ensued, Bobby, an emissary sent by Virgil, knocked on the door to inform Dan that due to mold in the bathroom, Virgil wanted to switch his room. Dan got the hint and adamantly refused their watchful eyes, as Virgil had promised him privacy, so he was staying put. With no other option, Bobby left disgruntled. The continuously repaired videotape delved deeper into Melody's records. What she witnessed in the activity room seemed like some sort of cult ceremony, accompanied by strange music, which turned out to be just a pop song when played on the recorder. Her best friend Annabelle speculated that Melody might know something. Suddenly, a resident named Cassandra entered, and although Melody greeted her, Cassandra ignored her and complimented Annabelle on her beauty instead. Melody inquired about the previous night's ceremony, but Cassandra flatly denied ever being there. Everyone seemed a bit mysterious here. Later, Melody met Jess, who mentioned getting into a fight upon their meeting. Melody attempted to contact her mother, but Jess strictly refused, stating her mother would only take her to see the old priest and try hard to believe in God. As Melody showed sympathy, Jess expressed her frustration with everyone's odd looks. Melody tried to offer comfort, but Jess rejected it, believing Melody couldn't truly understand. In a casual chat with Annabelle, Melody mentioned her upcoming Saturday appointment with her psychologist. Realizing the importance, Dan quickly found the tape from that day. It turned out that to help Jess, Melody had taken her to see his psychologist father for counseling. Jess described a bizarre sensation, saying she was dragged into some place. After the session, the psychologist shared his view that Jess's condition might be due to excessive stress or panic disorder, and it could also be epilepsy. The best approach would be a brain CT scan, but that would require parental consent. While they were discussing, Jess's mother burst in, furiously scolding Melody for interfering in her child's affairs. Eventually, Jess clarified that she had kept it from her mother, which put the psychologist in an awkward position. He reminded Melody not to get involved with other people's children, but Melody replied that she used to pray that someone would take care of her. After finishing the video, Dan regained his composure and noticed Bobby acting strangely. She was also reviewing Melody's footage. Dan hurried over to inquire, but Bobby made an excuse, claiming she was just helping with a check. Dan then asked for a favor, wondering if she could unlock the sealed chapel. Without a word, Bobby left the scene. On the other side, Mark had found Melody's address and asked about the terrible fire. Melody regretfully mentioned she hadn't found her mother, and her memories of the fire were hazy. It turns out, after waking up from her burns, she found herself in a hospital listed as a Jane Doe. Now, she just wanted to start her life anew. When asked about the apartment's residents, Melody surprisingly had no recollection. Mark played a piece of music for her, a tune that was supposed to be haunting, but Melody felt nothing. It was as if the Melody before them wasn't the real Melody anymore. When Dan was fixing the tape, he realized he was missing a tool. On his way to retrieve it, he encountered Melody amidst strange, dusty air. It seems like the mysterious house was causing a temporal displacement, allowing Dan to meet Melody. Suddenly, Dan woke up. It had all been a dream. Following this, the old priest, mentioned earlier by Jess, became the next interview target. With curiosity, the priest agreed to Melody's interview. He spoke of witchcraft and demons, but as soon as the Visser apartment was mentioned, cries for help came from outside. They rushed out to find Jess convulsing on the ground. Melody wanted to call an ambulance, but the priest said it wasn't necessary. After whispering a few words into Jess's ear, the girl calmed down, which surprised Melody. The conversation between Melody and Annabelle left Dan bewildered, as the words matched exactly what was said in his dream. That night, they tried to find Jess, but no matter how much they knocked, no one answered, yet loud noise came from inside the room. Melody realized something was wrong. After seeking help from other residents, they used a key to open the door. To their shock, the priest was performing an exorcism on Jess. Melody rushed to intervene, but her heavy body was pushed aside easily by the priest. Helpless, Jess pleaded miserably, and just then Samuel appeared, driving the priest out and promising to help find a doctor for Jess. Melody, who came out, scolded the priest, but the priest accused her of being obstinate, not understanding the apartment situation. Before leaving, he warned her that if she didn't leave Visser apartment soon, endless nightmares would await her. Melody felt a chill run down her spine and was startled. Witnessing this, Dan was also very confused, wondering if what the priest said about this apartment was true. Dan later got in touch with Mark, and surprisingly, Mark lied to Dan, claiming he hadn't seen Melody at her home and that he had left a note saying he would return in a few days to look for her. Dan then shared his own discovery. Although Bobby hadn't helped him open the church, he had found an entrance to a tunnel. There was a surveillance camera in the hallway, so he recorded 7 hours of blank footage to replace the live surveillance feed. If they could just figure out the door's code, they could enter the tunnel. Suddenly, Mark confessed to his earlier deception. From what he understood, someone had been impersonating Melody. The Melody he met there wasn't the real one, and tragically, the real Melody had already died. The impersonator could only use social benefits like healthcare by stealing her identity. This revelation somewhat disheartened Dan. He reviewed Melody's videotape, and bizarrely, Melody seemed to engage in a conversation with him across the void, causing Dan to be confused even more. Suddenly, Melody made an excuse to leave, and then Cassandra arrived at the supermarket and slowly approached the camera, warning him to not meddle in affairs. It turns out to be another nightmare for Dan. The eerie videotape, the strange house, all of this was overwhelming for Dan. To open the tunnel entrance, Dan tried many methods but was unsuccessful. With no other options, he went outside to make a phone call for help, to see if anyone could crack such a password lock. Just as he finished the call, an apparition of Melody appeared before him once again. Dan wanted to reach out and touch it when Bobby woke him. It was now 8 p.m., and Bobby claimed she had been standing there the whole time. Frightened, Dan hurried back to the apartment. Then Virgil called to rush him to start work. In his panic, Dan finally began working on the next tape. The repaired videotape continued Melody's record. Cassandra appeared to be a medium, with her house full of items used for spirit communication. The statue used in rituals was also stored there. Melody wanted to take a look, but Cassandra made the excuse of not being able to find the key. Then Cassandra showed her a spiritual pendant, and something weird happened. Melody checked and found her shadow in the mirror began to distort as if interacting with the spirit world. Suddenly, Cassandra gave Melody and her friend a bottle of paint as a gift. As Annabelle thanked her, she mentioned Melody's mother, suspecting Cassandra might know her. But when they mentioned the name of Melody's mother, Cassandra seemed to have no recollection. However, she invited the two to a party the next night. Perhaps someone else would recognize Melody's mother. Turning back into the corridor, the two girls encountered Samuel. It turned out he came to ask about the keys. While Melody went to fetch them, Annabelle confronted him, saying that he was wooing Melody while messing around with other women. But at this point, Melody couldn't care less. The video ended there, and suddenly, Dan heard a strange noise. His memories were dragged back to his childhood when his sister mentioned their father could see ghosts, and that ghosts were everywhere. The next second, Dan awoke with a start from his bed, yet he was still dreaming as Melody's apparition appeared again in the apartment. On the bed, he found the old film reel his father had given him. Dan introduced it to Melody as a birthday gift from his father, who was no longer with them. Speaking of gifts, Melody also brought out a pendant that her mother had left behind. At that point, Dan mentioned that she and his father knew each other. Melody was stunned when she realized that the psychologist was Dan's father, and she couldn't believe it. In her memory, the psychologist was still alive and couldn't possibly have such a grown son. Suddenly, the light bulb in the room went out. When Dan went to turn it back on, Melody had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a diary signed Bellows. To his surprise, the wardrobe was full of diaries, all signed by Bellows. One of them was filled with numbers, and notably, a set of them was circled. Realizing what it meant, Dan understood that this was the code for the password-protected door. Sure enough, after trying the numbers, the door swung open, revealing a trove of documents. After searching, Dan found his father's files, including a paper on extrasensory experiences and hallucinations. This is exactly what Dan was experiencing, authored by his own father. Additionally, the archive collected a vast array of artifacts from Visser apartments, including photos, objects, and a ring that belonged to Melody. Mark was puzzled when he learned about this and wondered who this Bellows was and if this person had also infiltrated the basement. Dan asked Mark to look into Bellows. Unexpectedly, Virgil found Mark and tried to bribe him, but Mark rebuffed him. That evening, Melody attended the party as promised, where she interviewed many people, but none recognized her mother. Suddenly, the arrival of an actress turned her into the center of attention. During the dinner, everyone mentioned the actress's late father, which made her a bit sad for a moment. Cassandra mentioned that she knew a good medium who could perhaps help the actress contact her father. While everyone was busy preparing for the seance, Melody sneaked off to open a cabinet, and surprisingly, Samuel ended up lending a hand. Inside the cabinet was just a self-portrait, seemingly different from the statue Melody had seen before. Immediately following, a seance was conducted with the medium's summoning, and the spirit of the father took possession of her. The actress mentioned a book her father gave her when she was 6, and unexpectedly, the medium recited its contents accurately, assuring the actress that she was indeed speaking to her father. Cassandra then urged the actress to inquire about the location of a videotape, supposedly containing footage of a massacre which disappeared before her father's death. However, the actress's question was met with an unrelated answer, and the seance ended abruptly. Panicked, Melody wanted to leave, but Cassandra suggested she try to contact her mother in this way. Perhaps she would get a response. The medium in fat continued the summoning, but there was no reply after a long wait. The medium couldn't feel Melody's mother's presence in the spirit world, yet she sensed another presence which startled Dan. Unexpectedly, Melody appeared from behind, recognizing the medium from the picture but couldn't remember who she was. Melody had come seeking Dan's help, but before she could speak, her mind became a blur. She suddenly noticed a notebook on the table, and her ring was also present. As Melody was bewildered, Dan remembered his sister's words, "They are just lost," meaning that what Dan saw was not a hallucination, but Melody's ghost. Realizing all this, Dan candidly told Melody that she had died in a fire 25 years ago, a reality too hard for Melody to accept. In disbelief, she screamed in a chicken voice and then disappeared with her chicken body. At that moment, the medium was possessed by a spirit, and the words she spoke were the same as what Dan had just told Melody, saying she was already dead. Dan realized that he had communicated with Melody from 25 years ago through the medium. If all this were true, Dan could prevent the fire from happening and save his family. As Dan shared this with Mark, a horrifying scene unfolded. The seance with the medium spiraled out of control, with her scratching her own greasy face uncontrollably. Melody also realized something, urgently questioning the medium about what followed, but the medium had already fallen into a coma due to her injuries. Back at the apartment, after disappearing for an entire night, Annabelle was found painting eerily. She told Melody that someone was in the painting, but its identity remained unknown. Afterward, Melody and Dan conversed across time and space, but just as Melody was about to learn more about the man, the medium, terrified, warned her not to let him out. A flustered Melody quickly found the psychologist and told him everything she had experienced. Melody mentioned the psychologist's son, saying that Dan told her she herself was dead. However, the psychologist didn't take it seriously, mentioning he had been suspended due to a report and referred to a certain cult named Baldung Coven, involved in supernatural psychic experiments targeting emotionally hypersensitive individuals like Melody. Clearly, the psychologist didn't believe her, so Melody wanted to show him the videotape, but just then the psychologist's family returned home, interrupting their conversation, and Melody had to plan to send the videotape to the psychologist another time. Back at the apartment, Annabelle had vanished without a trace, and Jess was also avoiding Melody, hiding away in her room. Melody revisited the recording of the seance, and to her shock, a ghostly figure appeared on the screen during a moment of static. This startled her to pee her pants. Afterward, she packaged the videotape and sent it to the psychologist. Suddenly, Jess knocked on her door, telling her that Annabelle had moved to live with Cassandra. Upon finding Cassandra, it was revealed that she wanted to give Annabelle creative space, so she let her stay in the room on the 6th floor. Melody immediately went there to find her. In the room, Annabelle was still painting and refused to let Melody see her work. Annabelle claimed the apartment was special, as if it could communicate with something, which made her speak in a distracted and disjointed way. Melody tried to persuade her to leave the apartment with her, but Annabelle not only refused to listen, she also kicked her out. Just as Melody was preparing to leave, she heard familiar music coming from a nearby door. Gathering her courage, Melody went inside. She found a run-down corridor and abandoned rooms with dispirited inhabitants and a group of people gasping heavily, just like what she had seen that fateful night. Suddenly, a girl's abrupt movement startled Melody. A panicked man then told Melody to hurry and find the old priest. At that moment, security arrived and drove the panicked man away. Melody thought they were all part of a cult, but security said they were just addicts. Not long after returning home, the panicked man from the 6th floor secretly approached Melody, knowing that she was searching for her mother. He said they could help each other. Melody listened to the man's story. He explained that someone didn't want them to leave and that they were asked to open a door. The panicked man had come here in hopes of finding a glowing mold called stardust, which could supposedly open a portal to another world. This revelation struck Melody as it was similar to her encounters with Dan. Melody then questioned him about her mother's whereabouts. The panicked man said there was no such name in the building, but there was someone who looked a lot like her. Before he could finish, the panicked man heard a voice coming from the building, calling out to them. Melody interrupted him as she too heard the sound. The panicked man then proposed a condition. If Melody could get the priest to help him get a residency card, he would assist in the search for her mother. With that in mind, Melody went to find the priest. However, to her dismay, she discovered that last night, the priest had fallen onto the train tracks and had been sent straight to meet Jesus. Now, all Melody could do was search for any belongings the priest might have left behind. In the office drawer, Melody found a rehab center form, which seemed to be the residency certificate the panicked man needed. Just as she was about to leave, she noticed an address on the desk and also found a key in the drawer. With the key in hand, Melody opened a wall cabinet and was surprised to see a map analyzing a place called Voss Manor, which is now the Visser apartments. She flipped through a book next to her, which was filled with graffiti about a cult, and it also contained records of the statue she had seen that night. The book had clippings about Samuel and others, but even more frightening was the introduction of a badge for Baldung Coven, which was the same design as the ring Melody wore. Just then, someone tried to open the door. Melody quickly hid after taking the book. It's Samuel who came in under the pretense of borrowing a book, and fortunately, Melody wasn't discovered. Suddenly realizing what was going on, Melody hastily called the psychologist. She deduced that this Baldung Coven was a cult, and her mother's ring indicated that her mother might have been a member. Unfortunately, she couldn't reach the psychologist and had to leave a message. Later, Melody received a pager message from her best friend Annabelle, who had an art exhibition that day. When they met, Melody convinced Annabelle to move out of Visser apartments with her. But Annabelle insisted on showing her paintings first, which depicted a woman Melody didn't recognize. Annabelle claimed she had seen this woman in another world and said the paint given by Cassandra had spiritual communication properties. Suddenly, Annabelle was pulled away by fans, leaving Melody staring at the painting. That's when she noticed mold on the wall. Then Annabelle and the gallery owner got into an argument because someone wanted to buy her painting, but Annabelle refused to sell it. Melody stepped in to mediate, but Annabelle pushed her away, claiming that Cassandra was right, that Melody had always been suppressing her creativity. Turning her attention away, Melody confronted Samuel about his cult member identity, accusing him of being behind the people on the 6th floor and the priest's death. In a moment of chaos, the panicked man suddenly died in a fall, shocking everyone present. What terrified Dan was that Virgil was at the scene, watching through the surveillance. Dan confronted Virgil, who soon appeared at the apartment. Virgil explained that Samuel was actually his brother, who had been full of potential. Now Dan only wanted to know why Virgil was really there. It turned out that Virgil suspected Melody had killed his brother, believing that evidence would be on the videotape, which is why he had asked Dan to repair them. He also speculated that Melody, in a mental breakdown, could have set fire to Visser apartments and might even be the one who killed his psychologist father. Dan found Virgil's defenses to be nonsense. However, he believed that once the videotapes were restored, the truth would come to light. Early in the morning, Mark brought good news. He had found a person named Bellows in the notebook. The password door could be opened thanks to Bellows' notebook. It turned out that Bellows had also been repairing videotapes in the room and after emerging from there developed severe delusions. Tragically, he died in a car accident later on. Therefore, Mark was very worried. To wrap up the work here, Dan destroyed all the surveillance and continued with the repairs. This time, Melody inexplicably woke up in the panicked man's room, and soon after, the police came to investigate her. Melody wanted to report Samuel but didn't have direct evidence. Later, she received a call from the hospital. It's Annabelle, who had been admitted as a psychiatric patient, suspected of drug-induced psychosis. This made Melody think of the mold in the building. To prove her friend's sanity, Melody sought paint with mold from Cassandra. However, not only did Cassandra refuse to provide it, but she also called over Jess to her house. Melody wanted to take her away from there, but Jess adamantly refused and even listened to Cassandra's claims that Melody was the one who was sick. When tea was accidentally spilled, Melody realized that Cassandra had been poisoning her friend and now Jess too. Previously, Jess had taken a jar containing mold. After much persuasion from Melody, Jess finally revealed the source. Melody immediately went to the basement, only to find the walls covered in black mold and a door inside the room. Just as she was about to approach it, Samuel appeared out of nowhere, startling her. The video got stuck at this point, so Dan quickly removed the tape, which was covered in mold. Taking the VCR, he was unnerved to find the interior also filled with mold. He immediately contacted Virgil, who failed to provide an answer but mentioned there was a spare VCR in the warehouse. Upon searching the warehouse, Dan shockingly discovered Bellows' video. He uncovered many secrets here, including information about the Gene Company, and more importantly, Bellows had revealed the truth behind Visser Apartments. Dan rushed to the display room and found that all the tapes being repaired were from Visser Apartments. He wanted to inform Mark, but there was no cell signal. At that moment, Bobby showed up, advising Dan not to meddle and just take the money and leave once the job was done. Later, Melody pressed for answers about the situation here. Samuel admitted that the mold was evidence of a world coexisting. To resolve her doubts, Melody followed Samuel to the basement where cultists were praying. The scriptures they chanted made Melody dizzy, and the statue she had seen in the book, named Cthulhu, embodying both god and demon, was also in this room. So Samuel and his group were indeed running a cult. Then Melody questioned whether her mother was one of them, but Samuel denied it. It turns out, the letter her mother had sent was also Samuel's doing, intended to lure Melody to Visser Apartments. Samuel claimed that the past, present, and future could all exist in the same space-time. He even played a video of a woman being sacrificed, hoping Melody would willingly sacrifice herself. Obviously, Melody didn't believe these absurd stories and was frightened. She quickly fled back to the apartment. Just as Melody was preparing to leave, she suddenly remembered a phrase that could contain the whole new world within oneself, which was exactly what Samuel had said. Worried about Jess, she rushed over to find her, only to discover that Cassandra had already taken Jess away. Perhaps Cassandra and her group were planning to use Jess for a sacrifice. Melody continued her search and headed to the 6th floor, but was stopped by the security guard. Sensing his ill intentions, Melody took off running. She hadn't expected that just as she reached the main entrance, the psychologist and his crew would forcibly take her away. Dan, while reviewing the footage, noticed something fishy. Upon closer inspection, he was shocked to see a ghostly figure attempting to crawl out of the screen. This sight sent chills down his spine. Terrified, he rushed into the display room to destroy the videotapes, but in his frenzy, he smashed a wall. Through the cracks, he saw nothing but mold. Then, he noticed a hidden door on the floor, also covered in mold. Upon opening it and venturing inside, Dan was horrified to find a room full of videos of Melody, and in the center of the hall stood a statue of the cult. It seems that this could be the former Visser Apartments. Melody's cries for help echoed from the screen, and just as Dan was entranced, he was knocked out from behind. When Dan woke up in the room, he tried to call Virgil, but couldn't get through. He went to Virgil's company only to receive a video call. Virgil claimed he had suffered a mental breakdown and was now sick. But Dan knew the truth. It's Virgil and his brother Samuel who had been corrupted and were part of the cult. Virgil told Dan to stop, take the money, and leave. However, Dan, entangled in the mystery, couldn't simply walk away. He went to find his friend Mark and handed him the video of Bellows. It showed that Bellows, like Dan, had seen the terrifying demon. Mark then unearthed clues about a cult called Baldung Coven, who had summoned demon Caligo from another dimension, and the leader of the cult back then was called Iris. The observant Dan realized that Iris was the person Mark had painted. The story traces back to 1924 at the Voss Manor, the predecessor of Visser Apartments. The rich manor owner Iris Voss invited her maid to her home. The same day, she also brought home the spirit-summoning statue Caligo. However, Iris had planned this in advance. Seeing the maid's curiosity about her pendant, Iris lured her in with comet-related information, speaking entirely of spiritism. At the dinner party, Iris gathered her cult followers for a seance. In the eerie atmosphere, assistants continuously photographed, trying to capture the products of the spirit world. Against all odds, they indeed captured images of the demon. If this had happened to anyone else, it would have sent shivers down their spine. But it was a blessing for Iris, who had lost her unborn child. It turns out, Iris wanted to make demon Kalego rise from the darkness and grant her a child. That's why Iris devoutly worshipped the demon and was obsessed with finding a sacrifice to complete the summoning ritual. The next day, while cleaning, the maid discovered mold that connected to the realm of the spirit world. Iris realized the demon was calling them. The maid was awakened in the night by a choking sensation in her throat. Just then, sounds came from outside. She hurriedly got up to investigate and found a woman attempting to take Iris's book. The maid stepped forward to stop her. That's when Iris arrived. It turned out the two knew each other. The woman was a member of the Baldung cult, and the book she was trying to take was the one used to summon demons. The woman wanted to prevent Iris from opening the demon's gate because their cult had once caused a great disaster by doing so. She tried to burn the book, but an assistant suddenly attacked her from behind and shot her dead. Iris didn't panic. Instead, she instructed the assistant to collect the woman's blood. Then she consoled the maid and ordered her to keep her mouth shut about the incident. Thinking the maid would be scared, Iris was surprised when the maid expressed a desire to join her cult the next day. However, the maid was unaware that all this had been Iris's plan all along. Dressed in formal attire, the maid transformed into a guest at the banquet and was led by Iris to the mansion's basement, where cult members had long been waiting. Iris then began the summoning ritual, with the assistant recording everything. The maid, unaware, did not realize she was about to become a sacrificial offering. Once the cult members donned their masks, Iris watered the statue with the collected human blood. She then recited a scripture to the maid, who thought she would be reborn. Suddenly, Iris slit her throat with a knife. After sacrificing a living person, Iris truly opened the gate to the spirit world, and the terrifying demon Kalego was released. The evil ritual came to an abrupt halt amid a flash of light. Dan thought that Samuel might have also conducted a similar ritual. As for Melody, Mark feared she had become a sacrificial offering, but Dan didn't believe so. He thought Virgil needed Melody and therefore wouldn't kill her for a sacrifice. But now, who else knew of her whereabouts? Dan thought of Melody's close friend Annabelle, but Mark suddenly interrupted, urging him to stop because everything had been cursed. Yet Dan was not satisfied. He wanted to clear Melody's name. The only clue now was to find Annabelle. In a mental hospital, they met Annabelle. She was not surprised by Dan's arrival, rather she wondered why he hadn't come sooner. Seeing the painting on the wall left Dan agape. Annabelle said that Melody was waiting in another world for Dan's rescue. Fortunately, the videotape Melody had sent earlier had allowed the psychologist to see through Samuel's trickery, but Melody didn't trust the other party and clamored to leave. In the end, the psychologist locked her up with her friend. However, to save Jess, Melody escaped through the window. Annabelle's revelations surprised Dan. She then handed over the tape that Jess had left for Dan. In it, Dan learned of Melody's whereabouts. To his surprise, she had returned to Visser Apartments and was trying to expose Samuel's crimes. As is shown in the video, Melody found her way to the 6th floor, where indeed Jess was locked in a room. Melody climbed in through the neighboring window. However, the brainwashed Jess was unwilling to leave, believing she would be blessed. After Melody's persuasion, Jess finally came to her senses. As they prepared to escape, someone suddenly knocked on the door. To cover Jess's departure, Melody chose to stay behind. The security guard burst in and knocked her unconscious. When Melody woke up again, she was already in the midst of the cult's sacrificial scene. Samuel started reciting scriptures, and then the security guard brought Melody in front of the statue. Samuel cut her hand, and her blood soaked into the demon statue. In the next second, Samuel sacrificed a devout follower, and the spirit world's gate was flung open. To Samuel's surprise, the person standing inside was Iris. As Samuel reeled from the shock, Jess, who had sneaked in, captured everything on camera. Melody tried to urge Jess to leave, but in the next moment, both Melody and Samuel disappeared into the spirit realm. Now, Dan finally understood Melody's situation. She was trapped in the spirit world. Thinking of a rescue, Dan thought of Virgil. Armed with the knowledge of Samuel's whereabouts, Dan successfully entered the manor. It turned out that Virgil had long been aware of the supernatural space and had involved Dan in the videotape restoration to find more information. Upon learning that Samuel had also been taken into the spirit realm, Virgil did not wish to rescue his brother. In a moment of impulsiveness, Dan attacked, but Virgil taught him a lesson with his gun. At that moment, Mark knocked Virgil out with a brick. Now the only thing Dan could think of was to perform the ritual to open the gate again, hoping to save Melody out of the spirit realm. With the blood vial they found, the two went down to the basement. But as soon as Dan opened the book, Bobby took control of Mark with a gun. Following this, Bobby revealed her identity. She was not only the witch of Baldung Coven, but also Melody's mother, who had been trying to save her daughter for 25 years. Now she and Dan had a common goal. Bobby knew that the spirit realm could be opened with the right frequency, but she could only hold it for 5 minutes. After reciting the scriptures, Bobby successfully opened the spirit realm, and without hesitation, Dan stepped in. After passing through, he saw his sister playing the piano. His family had died in a fire years ago, and now he was reunited with them in this place. Dan felt an indescribable sorrow, but the thought of Melody suddenly flashed through his mind, reminding him of his purpose. He started searching and finally found her in a church. However, as Dan prepared to leave with her, the church bells rang and the world began to collapse. To Dan's astonishment, the way back had turned into a room. The TV showed the way back, and as Dan tried to find a way out, Melody was drawn to a noise on the side. She heard the sounds that she had heard when she first came to the apartment, sounds that were actually made by a demon. The terrified pair fled to the stairwell, where Samuel suddenly pulled Melody away. However, Dan did not know that Melody had already returned to the real world, while he remained trapped inside. Suddenly, Dan woke up, only to find himself stuck in the past, and with that, the drama concludes. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.